Okay, so here we are in our next installment with the Power Automate. And this time we're going to talk about, let's scroll down to the bottom here, integration patterns, right? So one of the other features that you can use with Power Automate is to integrate with other enterprise data. So it could be integrating with a SQL database or any database that's on-prem. You can integrate with an enterprise solution that could be hosted on-prem or in the cloud, or you can integrate with a file share, for example, that sits on-prem. Now, the integration options are pretty endless because they're really going to fall into probably three main patterns, right? So there's going to be a pull pattern where you're in M365 and you're pulling the data and you're getting a shadow copy of that data from on-prem and you're storing it. And I love to store it in a SharePoint list because that becomes a real trivial data source to Power Apps as well as Power Automate to interact with on-prem data pulled as a shadow copy into the SharePoint list. And I'll show you what that pattern looks like. The other one would be REST API, and we'll talk through API. So let's look at the pull data pattern, right? So for the pull data pattern, I got a lot of failed attempts here. It actually took me a while to shoot this video. I don't know why. I think it's so much information to cover that I started and stopped this several times. Okay, so here we have a line in the sand, right? So over here on the left is going to be your on-prem, and then over here on the right would be your M365 tenant, right? And of course, with M365 tenant, that would include SharePoint Online, Microsoft Teams, Power Platform, Now, the way that this looks is that you have an on-prem, let's just call it Oracle. You have an on-prem Oracle database, and you have the Power Platform in M365. So let me just throw a label on these. And within that Power Platform, let's focus on Power Automate, okay? So you have this Power Automate, and let's just say this is a scheduled job, and it's going to go against your on-prem data source, and it's not going to make, it's going to make this leap. I'm going to just show this diagram, then we're going to get into the technical how it goes from a Microsoft 365 tenant to your on-prem inner network, right? So just imagine that this Power Automate batch job is going to go to this Oracle instance, and it's going to pull data back, right? So it's going to pull this data back, and then what Power Automate will probably do 9 times out of 10, and I love this. Again, I'm a huge fan of leveraging SharePoint lists or SharePoint document libraries, especially for integration. It's going to take that data and then dump it into a SharePoint list. Okay, let's put a label on it, and let's show our arrow loading the list, right? Now, this list, this data load, right, that is going to pull that Oracle data, that data load into that SharePoint list, that can be one or two patterns, right? So you can do a complete, every time this job runs, because it's a batch job, right, that we do in Power Automate. Every time the job runs, you can say, okay, for this list, I'm going to delete all the rows, then I'm going to reload it to make sure I got the latest and greatest. And that really, and then the other pattern would be a Delta sync, meaning that, okay, I'm going to build this Power Automate batch job to be extremely smart, to where it's only going to load newly created records or updated records that already exist, or deleted records. That's the other operation you have to take into consideration. And what it would do is massage that SharePoint list existing data to match the Oracle, right? And then from there, the integration magic really would then be a Power App form, right? Let's just go put a label on it. In this Power App form, this could be a standalone form, it could be a SharePoint custom list form, wherever the case may be, mobile app, or wherever the case may be. The options are endless. It's really up to your creativity. And that Power App form will interact with that SharePoint list, which is really a trivial scenario, right? Especially once you start building Power Apps. Interacting with a SharePoint list or a Dataverse becomes really most of your more common scenarios. All right, so that's one. And we call this the pull pattern because that call is initiated from Power Automate and it's reaching out to on-prem and it's pulling that data in. Now, the biggest question may be, how in the world are you crossing this firewall? Right? And exactly that's what it is, right? So most organizations, your organization, my organization, we build, the networking team build this infrastructure, network, right? And they protect it from the firewall with a firewall. And it could be many layers to make that happen. And that's just to keep intrusion from penetrating our network and then hacking and stealing data and da. So obviously this is not going to be as straightforward as this diagram shows. So what's happening behind the scenes is this thing called the gateway. Let me clean this up a little bit. Let me get rid of these X's. Oh, I got rid of too much. Let me redraw my firewall, right? So here you have the gateway. That's going to be, there we go. There's a missing arrow. All right, so you have the gateway. Let's label this the gateway, right? And basically what this gateway is almost like the best way to imagine this, and I was explaining this to someone else, is imagine the gateway is like a VPN tunnel, right? So with the VPN tunnel, it's just say, okay, here's access to the internet, but you're going to do it in this protected space, and we're going to monitor and define the type of traffic that can come and go through this tunnel. And that's exactly what the gateway does, right? So this is a Microsoft 365 gateway, and the way that the gateway, and let's just take this moment to do a level 2 or level 3 deep dive into what the gateway is and high level how it's configured, and how with the Power Platform you would interact with it. All right. So the gateway is going to be like a plugin, and basically on-prem, you're going to have a Windows server, and this probably be your Win 2019 server or whatever the case may be. And then you're going to have these gateway plugins installed on it. And when you configure that plugin, you install it, basically you give it a service account. So that service account is important, right? Because the biggest question is, okay, I'm establishing this gateway, and what does that mean? All right, I'm giving the Microsoft 365 tenant, the Power Platform or Power BI, access to this internal company data. How do I control that? Do I give them access to everything inside the network, or maybe I want to be more responsible and only give them access to this server, this file share, this entity, blah, 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 right? How do you manage that? And that's all managed through the service account that's installed with the plugin. Now, note the difference though. That service account, this service account is going to be in your Active Directory, not Azure AD, but your local Active Directory. And it's going to, basically what you're going to do is give it access to your Oracle server. You're going to give it access to your file share. You're going to give it access to your SAP API, or your, some .NET application that make SAP REST calls internally, or your custom REST API service, right? And you're going to control if it has, when you give it access, what type of access. Is it read-write? Is it full control? Is it read-only? And you can mix and match those against all the assets. Very similar to giving any other service account access to your on-prem services. Now, when you do that, you're in turn letting Power Platform, you're really kind of defining the guardrails for the Power Platform. Now, what the service account does not do is not the authorization to a particular table in Oracle, or a particular stored proc, or a particular folder on the file share, or a particular module within SAP, right? So this just really kind of gives them access to the asset. And then here in the Power Platform, using the connector framework, right? So you have these different connectors in Power Automate. You have these different connectors available to you called data sources and Power Apps. And basically what these connectors would do, you would have one for Oracle. It will establish the gateway. It will establish access to the gateway. That service account that says, okay, we have 20 Oracle servers, but Oracle 1, right? This server, Oracle 1, is the only server that you have access to. Now, when this Oracle connector in Power Automate go through the gateway and it finds Oracle 1, even though 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 would not even be available to them, it's not even options, then within Oracle 1, it says these sort of stored procs you have access to, right? And what you have access to is defined, you guessed it, by the service account, right? And then here in the connector, I would then either specify a database account or some Windows crash or something that says, okay, based on this table and the credentials I'm logging in with, give me the roles that I'm authorized to see. And that's an all or nothing, right? So it's not going to be a scenario where, and I know this is getting way too technical, but it's not going to be a scenario where I have user one, and if user one was on-prem interacting with this Oracle table, then this will be security trimmed based on user one credentials. This will not do that, right? Because it doesn't run in the context of the user. It runs in the context of whatever service account that's defined in that connection, and that data will be available to everyone. Obviously, you can do filtering based on the current user, right? So imagine if there were HR records and you were interacting with Oracle because that's your HR or IIS system, and it's storing vacation information, and you're going to bring back vacation for all users. But here in the Power Platform, you would get a filter that says, okay, for the current user who triggered this request, let me filter these 10,000 records to only these 5,000 that are relevant to this user, right? And you can even bake in that filter query into the Oracle, especially if you use like a stored procedure or something like that. You can then pass that user's email address or network ID or whatever unique identifying information for that user to that stored proc. The filter is done here, which is probably a better model or better design. So that way, instead of bringing back the whole 10,000 and filtering within Power Automate, you do the filtering on the Oracle side, and only the 10 records, related to that user are returned. Okay, that's enough. That was my level 2 deep dive on the gateway, understanding the role and responsibility of the service account used to establish the plugin on the Windows server, as well as the authentication that's done in the connector to interact with them. Okay, so that's going to be our pull pattern. That's how you request data from on-prem and kind of bring it out to M365. What's the other pattern? The other pattern is going to be, let's call this is going to be our REST API pattern. So again, you have your Power Platform, and then within that, you have your Power Automate, right? And then imagine with the API service, imagine that you have a custom solution on-prem. So here I have a .NET application, and this is going to be like my web API. And this web API is going to be my integration service for some data behind the scene, right? And it exposes this data via API services. So now what you can do, you can have your firewall team open up certain ports to where these APIs will be accessible from the outside, and then in Power Automate, you can write the connectors, or you can build a custom connector. You can build a custom connector that would then communicate via these APIs that are exposed to the outside, and then make those calls accordingly. Now, I haven't seen, and this is something that we have to research. If you played with this pattern before, with the APIs, reaching back into on-prem, if you ever did that via a gateway, go ahead and leave that in the chat and then explain how, just high level, right? We don't want to expose any company secrets or any, company identifiable information, but just in the generic way, have you used a custom API to go against the gateway to access a web API or some API on-prem, right? The other one would be, again, a custom connector that's calling the API. And I love this pattern because now imagine that you have this horizontal quad, and this is going to be your on-prem SaaS, and this is going to be access to the same SaaS in the cloud. And what does that mean? So imagine if you had Salesforce, right? Salesforce is hosted in the cloud. It's very similar to M365, right? You have to use the internet to get access to it. So usually what some network teams would do is that they will build the firewall rules that says, yep, you're going outside to access this information. One, we're going to put in SSO, so that way your on-prem creds will authenticate you to this Salesforce cloud solution or platform. And you're going to interact with data, but these are the rules in the firewall. We're going to make sure you're communicating to Salesforce, and you're only able to do these types of calls to Salesforce and Salesforce only, right? That would be your example of your on-prem SaaS. SaaS is still in the cloud, right? That's the whole benefit of it, is that it's not in your data center. It's hosted in the cloud somewhere else, managed by the vendor. But now your on-prem systems are primed, and your firewall is primed to interact with it, to where from the inside, it feels like it's sitting alongside of your other applications that are actually on-prem. That's what I mean by on-prem SaaS. Now SaaS cloud is that scenario, and you see this now with M365, where as a user, I don't have to be on my company's VPN to access this. My credits will allow me to access this from any computer, any device in the world, right? That's going to be your software as a, and these are the same instance, right? The on-prem versus cloud, it just says where you are when you initiate that call. Now for M365, it won't do this, right? It won't do a round robin where I'm going to go on-prem and then turn around and make a cloud SaaS call, or I'm going to go on-prem to make a on-prem initiated looking like request to a SaaS application that sits in the cloud. So I'm not going to, I'm not going to do that. But instead, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use Power Automate with the same custom connector, and something as popular as Salesforce would probably already have a connector to where I don't have to customize it. But then I will make that connector and connect to Salesforce or whatever the case may be, and make those requests and bring that data back. And then once I have that data, I can do whatever I want to with it, right? If I want to stage that data into a SharePoint list, just to kind of make all subsequent calls that much more efficient, I can do that, and that will kind of match our pool data scenario, right? So that's going to be the pool. Now, let's talk about the last one. The last one is going to be when you're on-prem, and you will see this a lot, right? You will see where you're on-prem. All right, let's talk about our next scenario. Our next scenario is where I'm actually on-prem, right? So I got my M365, I got my on-prem, and I have my Power Platform, I have my Power Automate, I have my SharePoint list. All right, so now on-prem, I'm going to have a server. Let's just call it a Windows server. It doesn't necessarily have to be Windows, because it's going to use the .NET Core. And basically, I have a console job. And basically, what this console job is going to do is push on-prem information out to SharePoint, right? Or out to M365 in whatever asset that you want to interact with. And the magic behind this operation is that it uses the PNP SDK core, or is it called PNP Core SDK? I think that's the name of it. PNP Core SDK, right? And we all know PNP is the Microsoft Pattern and Practices, really kind of building shortcuts and reusable patterns to interact with SharePoint. That was his birth. Since then, and you can use that for like custom web parts with SharePoint Online, SPFX. You can use it for PowerShell. There's a PowerShell module that gets plugged in, and the most popular one is the .NET Core set of libraries that you can use as a .NET developer. And basically, this has baked into it the authentication and the authentication framework to allow you to safely authenticate to M365 using Azure and an app that's registered in Azure. So you can do that type of authentication, and you can do that using client secrets and a certificate for like a private and public key, right? So once you get through that authentication, now you have access using either the Graph API or the SharePoint API to interact with majority of the assets in Microsoft 365. I would say majority because maybe everything is not part of the API, but understand that the Graph API is the common pattern that Microsoft is pushing. So whatever you can do in the Graph API, you will have access to it with the PNP Core SDK. Really, really powerful, because you can have a scenario where you have a file share on-prem, right? And you may have some backend system that's updating data or populating data or driving data, or even human processes that are updating this file share. And now that you migrated your on-prem SharePoint to the cloud, on-prem, you may have had integrations with this file share on picking up documents or dropping documents or doing whatever to kind of interact with those backend systems. So now the question is, now that we migrated to the cloud, what happens to those integration points? And this is where the .NET Core Console, and I love this pattern because I would call this a push pattern, because basically you're on-prem in this .NET Core SDK, this PNP SDK is actually pushing data to a SharePoint list, or in the form of a file share, it could be pushing data to a SharePoint library, right? So here I have let's call this the SP library, right? So, and the beauty of this piece, if the gateway scared you, is the fact that you can do a push without a gateway. I think the only sticky point with a push, and this is just going to take you a few cycles to get it right, is to set up the authentication with a certificate and key on your SDK on-prem, right? Because basically you're creating a service account, a service account type pattern that says, all of this data is going to be processed under the authorization of the service account, and I'm going to push that data to a SharePoint library, a SharePoint list. And the key with all of these, right, with all of these patterns is the fact that you get the data from whatever source it may be, and that can be an enterprise SaaS, it could be an on-prem file share, on-prem SQL, on-prem Oracle, wherever the case may be. You want to get that data and store it inside of a SharePoint list or a SharePoint library, because once you get that data there, everything you need to do in M365 becomes possible. Not only possible, but trivial, right? It becomes a really standard practice or a really standard pattern to interact with SharePoint lists and SharePoint libraries, okay? Now, one of the things I did not really focus on is the cost of building such patterns, right? Some of these, especially when you get to the gateway pattern or any pattern that requires the gateway to kind of go from M365 to on-prem, the gateway to set up is no cost. Most of the time that's built into your standard or your typical subscription. The cost comes in is when you try to use a connector to use the gateway. So the SQL connector that connects to SQL on-prem is a premium connector. The API connector that you want to create to interact with other enterprise solutions, most of the common ones are premium connectors. If you want to custom build a connector, because you're going to define the API interface to interact with another REST API that's hosted in the cloud somewhere else, on a different SaaS or platform as a service, or a custom one as API that you need to get to that's on-prem, to build that custom connector, that's a premium connection. So the biggest question is always going to be, when you start talking premium, is what is the most cost-effective way that we can build these solutions to where, one, I'm not paying a premium for every user each month within my organization, or two, I can build a cost-efficient pattern to where, one, it can satisfy this business requirement, it doesn't exponentially cost my organization money, and I can scale with this pattern, and that meaning that I can reuse it in many different scenarios. And that's the piece that I really want to talk about in the next video. So until then, just reminders. I know I kind of took you all over the place. I kind of went probably 1 or 2 technical levels deep talking about the gateway, a little bit on the tangent, but I still think it was relevant. So yeah, rewatch this. Any questions, leave them in the comment section. If you use gateways in a really cool way, or if you want to share your experience with integrations with on-prem after you migrated to the cloud, go ahead and leave those in the comments. I will highlight some of those comments in the next video. Until then, I'll see you tomorrow.